Today, I'm going to talk about three different kind of aspects of what's been going on in Montreal. I'm going to present to you Montréal Ouvert and our approach and how we've been able to collaborate with different types of stakeholders at the city, with the politicians, then also different civic groups. Okay? And then I'm going to talk about some of the applications and then some of the way that open data has generated solutions. Okay, in real life terms, okay, starting from like basic applications and how open data has become part of a mobilization kind of force in the city. Okay, and then last, I'm going to talk about the elections that we had not too long ago and how we've continued that conversation with the new administration and the candidates that were running in those elections. Because I know that we're probably going to have elections coming up soon. Toronto is not too far away from Montreal, so we've also been able to keep track of your politics. You know, as I'm sure you've kept track of ours as well. Okay, and just a bit of background about myself. So Jean-Noé Landry, I'm not a developer. I'm not a designer. I've been involved in open data through Montréal Ouvert since we started in like 2009, 2010. But before that, I was working more internationally with political movements. So I've worked in different countries for different international organizations. So I'm about bringing different networks, different organizations, different individuals together. And I'm also a political party trainer. I work at the federal office of the NDP, at the parliamentary office in Montreal. I'm the main trainer for Quebec, and I also advise our digital issues critic, Mathieu Ravigna, who shadows Tony Clement. I'm also on the chantier, the Democracy Task Force, sorry, these terms are in French, so the Task Force on Democracy for the Mayor of Montreal. So on participatory democracy, very involved in that, and other community organizations. Okay, so as you do, probably wear different hats. So, but open data for me is not only just a good idea, it's an idea that has a lot of potential and that's been able to bring a lot of people together. Okay, so that's going to be the main gist of the talk today. So this was our first public meeting that we organized, okay, for Montréal Ouvert. There's 4 of us at Montréal Ouvert. There's me, I just introduced myself. There's Michael Lenzner, who runs AYA, okay, AYA, an organization, a nonprofit that provides and helps nonprofits get funding, okay, through data, through different funding sources from the government, from different provincial level, but also at the federal level. There's John Brunn, who has his own company also, and he does environmental audits. And then there's Sébastien Pierre, who's the 4th member, who's the 4th co-founder, and he has a data visualization company called FF Function. So the 4 of us have different backgrounds, and that's been one of the successes of our approach, is that we work well together, but we complete each other very well, okay? It's not, we're not all developers. Some of us have that strength, that ability, but we were Anglophone, Francophone, so that was purposeful in the way that we came together and built Montréal Ouvert. What the primary objective of Montréal Ouvert at the beginning was about adopting a policy, getting the city to adopt a policy. Because if there wasn't a policy, then if it wasn't in law, then we could organize a lot of apps, we could try to do different things. But we needed the legal framework that it would enable us to then have a portal, then have access systematically to data in the right format. So that was the primary objective, but then it started to grow. And as it started to grow, and this was the chalkboard at our first public meeting, as I said, where we didn't know how many people were going to show up. Okay, we just kind of put out an invitation, and 80 people showed up at this meeting. From all walks of life, literally, okay? Like, we had like librarians, archivists, community organizers, urban planners, geeks, like a whole bunch of different types of people came. People from the city that had been talking about open data also internally, but weren't necessarily getting a lot of traction in that conversation. So we realized that we were onto something. And as we continued our work, Montréal Ouvert's mandate kind of evolved while still keeping our primary objective of getting a policy adopted. We became kind of a platform. we wanted to facilitate spaces where people could come together and continue reaping the benefits of open data while lobbying public officials and the politicians to adopt the right policy. Okay? So I'm explaining this at the beginning because for me, open data is also about movement building, where there are challenges that are associated with movement building in terms of the flexibility of building a movement, in terms of not claiming the movement to yourself, but to share that space with others in a very collaborative way. Okay, so that's been really at the center of what we've tried to do, and there's a lot of challenges related to that. As you scale out, you're also scaling deeper, and you're engaging a lot of different types of stakeholders. So that's something that emerged over time. In terms of the context here, you probably don't know who this person is, but in Quebec, this is a very widely known person. This is the commissaire Charbonneau. So we've had a public commission on publicly allocated contracts and political party financing in Quebec over the last 8-9 months. She's been on TV a lot. Okay, so people know who this person is. She's smiling, but she deals with a lot of people that are in compromising positions. Okay, and so for us, open data has become a good idea, a solution to a crisis in Quebec society: corruption and collusion. Okay, and this is, at the beginning, we didn't anticipate that it would become that, but politicians have latched on to it, okay, in a way that's given us more credibility and enabled us to have way more conversations with different people that now see the importance and the potential of open data. Now, Quebec is not just about corruption, okay? I know that for some reporters it is, okay? I'm not gonna get into that. Montreal has a very deep history of citizen engagement, and it has institutions that protect those rights. I'm going to tell you a little bit more later about our charter, the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities of the city, which is a unique document for cities in North America, actually. We have 29 working groups across the city that bring citizens around different issues. I'm going to tell you about the open data citizens group, table de concertation, as we call it, working group with the city, okay? Because that's a model that I think might be useful to you. Montreal also has a very vibrant IT sector. A lot of startups. There's different hubs here and there. That's also really happening. And a very vibrant civil society itself, okay? Probably heard about our protests. It's not just about the protests. There's a lot of civil society organizations. So it's very, very dynamic. So it's about bringing these communities, these types of different people together to develop solutions that correspond more to the people who live in Montreal through open data. And that's really been at the core of what we're trying to do. So this is our logo at the top, and this is the logo of Montreal. Okay, I talked about collaboration. This was really important to us. Okay, and if you look at the optics, we weren't there at the beginning to demand open data, because we knew that the likelihood of us being able to have those doors open and to have that conversation probably wouldn't go very far. Okay, so we purposefully chose that image to mimic the one of the city to say that we wanted to communicate and to enter a dialogue. And the different case that we were able to make, whether it's the economic benefits, whether it's the social or political benefits or democratic benefits of open data, vary depending on who we spoke to. And we were talking to civil society, the media in English and both in French, public administrators, and then also politicians, all at once. Okay, so the four of us, good thing there was four of us, because we needed to have all hands on deck to be able to have all those conversations at once and to reach out, really to mobilize people and to get the word out. And we participated in many different types of public consultations as well, because we needed open data to become kind of ingrained in the deliberative and the participatory process of how citizens can engage more with their public institutions, okay? So as you can see, it wasn't something that was primarily led from the tech side. Okay, it was very much led from the citizen engagement side. Okay, so I talked about the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities. So one of the first things that we did was to try to amend that document. Okay, and this is the clause that we focused on. If you read it, then you see the foster participation. This is about some of the commitments. Article 16: to foster participation by citizens in municipal affairs. Montreal is committed to encouraging public participation and to this end, providing citizens with useful information delivered in clear language and supporting the use of appropriate communication practices, etc. This obviously doesn't correspond with open data. So for us, we wanted to change that. So we didn't have a policy yet in place, but we wanted to amend the charter of the city so that open data would become a right for citizens in Montreal. It didn't pass, okay? But it doesn't matter because the message got out that we were trying to change the city institutionally so that open data would become the right of every citizen living on Montreal Island. We participated in other commissions, and we worked, there's a range of other presentations that we made, but that was one of the main ones that really got our message across, I think. So yes, we organized hackathons, okay? That was, that's something that we needed to do because we needed to demonstrate, the outcomes of using open data. And people were excited about that. So yeah, we had, the contests and we had, the prizes, and we also did that. And at the beginning, the first hackathon that we organized, we had 250 people who came. It was organized collaboratively with the city. Great result, great visibility, and the city was very happy with it because from a communications perspective, they were able to say, look, we're doing something. We're responding to the community, right? But we wanted to go further than that. Because as we know, and I hope we're able to talk about this, the outcomes of hackathons, right? And looking at the model of hackathons, there's a big challenge now that we're dealing with. What comes before, what comes after. So looking at hackathons in terms of a process beyond a single kind of one-off event, because there's only so much you can do over the span of a weekend or an evening, right? So as we started to evolve and continue to progress, we organized an event around corruption. Again, linking back to the context, okay? And that was hacking corruption. You may have heard of it. The guy who's there, this is a politician, Duchesneau. So Duchesneau used to be the chief of the anti-corruption unit of the police, okay? So he was very interested in looking at this and going like, who are these people that are these citizens that want to participate in fixing our system, fixing our society? Okay, so he had a lot of interest into this. So he came and he gave a speech, like, okay, great. And in parallel to the hacking or the development of different apps that was taking place, we also had workshops for citizens to be able to familiarize themselves with open data and then corruption issues also. So there was a civic awareness and civic education component that was tied into the hackathon model at a very early stage in what we were trying to do. Okay, that was very, very important to us. The main prize that was given out at the hackathon on this occasion was an application called contracts.net, okay, and that was dealing with the database for the allocation of public contracts, okay, at the municipal, but then also at the provincial level. And I'll mention it also later on because this is an ongoing project. It's evolved a lot, okay? But that was the start of when it really came together, and the developers that started working on it then, this is like a year and a half ago, have continued since working on this application, and they've created a partnership now with the Treasury Board at the provincial level, and there's interaction and retroaction on both ends, okay? So it's a very, very dynamic way that it's evolved now, all around open data. Okay, so this is the portal. From the city. This is actually just one part of it. The reason why I put this up is that this is an announcement asking for individuals or organizations to present themselves to sit on this working group on open data. And the working group on open data was put in place after the city decided to officially go ahead with its policy. Okay, so it adopted the policy and then it launched this open group. And the open group was constituted 50% by representatives of the city, and then 50% by citizens. But then also the tech sector, the university or research sector, and then civil society. And they were there and able to interact with city officials. So you had the head of IT, the head of the librarians, archives, internet division, social media. So you had like 6 public officials that were sitting at the same table with citizens that were there. And it was very interesting at first because it enabled us to keep track of each other, right? To have a formal space where we could interact and ask questions. It's okay, and receive information about what was going on internally inside the city, because it wasn't really obvious all the time for us, right? We had our contacts, but we didn't always know, like, okay, where are you in the process of opening up this data set or that data set, for example, right? So it was important to have that space. So at the beginning, it was more information sharing. Then in the second year, we changed that, the mandate, more for like an outreach or liaison type of mandate. So, and this is what that announcement is about, so that people that wanted to build or propose a project would be able to sit on the working group and have the city back them up. So to help them get the data from other city administrators to facilitate the creation process of applications or different types of analysis around data, okay? It worked to some extent, okay? Because then we entered into an election year and it became complicated to be able to get the bureaucracy to actually proactively share the data in time and to work as fast as we were working, essentially, because we were putting in the hours and we were mobilizing around this like great problem-solving process around data, but the data was lacking from the city. Okay, so there were some shortcomings there, but the idea of a consultative body like that, I think, is a good one, but it could be improved. Okay, and this is one of the things that we want the new mayor and the new administration to work on, because it's interesting, but we don't want this to be a waste of time, and we don't want this to be a communications exercise also. Okay, we want this to be taken seriously. Okay, I'm going to give you just a sequence of different examples of types of applications that were created in Montreal by the developer community, but not just by the developer community. Okay, and that's one of the main points that I wanted to kind of take away from my presentation. As you know from working with open data or in the area of open data is fundamentally a problem-solving exercise, right? You have data, but the meaning of the data has to be contextualized in real life. So that's why citizens and developers and different types of people come together and they look at the data and say, okay, what does that tell us? But at first is the question that comes, right? Behind every good application, there's a fundamental question that is tried to be resolved. So for this is Pets near Montreal. So the question behind this application is, where can I find the best ice hockey rink, the ice condition in my neighborhood or around where I live? There are many, many ice rinks, outdoor ice rinks in Montreal. Every day, the city puts out reports of ice conditions, but these were in PDFs, sitting somewhere in a database, on the city website. Nobody really read them, right? But this is very valuable data, because if you come back from work and you want to know where you can put your skates on and play with your friends, hockey outside, you want to be able to know where you can. So this is a very concrete example of an application that enabled services to be more flexible, more adapted, and more accessible to citizens, because they want to use the services, right? And you even had, as a tab on this application, a space where you could thank the city for the good ice conditions that it was providing to the residents of the borough where they lived. Okay, so it's a nice kind of gesture to thank the city workers also. So that's kind of like a basic level application, but that has like a real impact on the quality of life of people. If we move on, this is another example. This is called Montréal Accessible. So Montréal Accessible was a project with different groups working from the people with disabilities community. Okay, so there was like 2 different groups that were working from that community, working with Montréal Ouvert and Open North also. Okay, and the issue there was about mapping spaces, public spaces, but also businesses, to be able to enable people with disabilities to know where they could go and what services they could expect from a certain business. Okay, a lot of this data was either didn't exist or was sitting again at the city in PDFs, not accessible, not very handy. So the idea behind it was, and this is a very rudimentary kind of pilot, okay? It's not very elaborate, but the idea behind it is very, very interesting, because what it did is that it brought together these different communities to collaborate in a way where we actually organized days of mobilization with a survey, and we went, developers and groups of people with disabilities on the street with questionnaires and collected data by going door to door, and we created an audit, essentially, with the criteria that these groups knew was important for them, because they were facing those challenges. So it actually matters a lot if there's a little step and you can't, go up with your wheelchair, or if there's a ramp, or these different types of issues. So through that method, we're able to collect that data and then map it out in a very basic way. This could be taken further, but the idea there was great, because it brought these different types of data, people interested in data, together, and we collaborated around this issue. Another example is, and this is a quote, before you read it, just let me explain it to you, okay? Because and I'm sure you have this in Toronto also, but there's a database of all the different infractions for landlords in terms of sanitary infractions of landlords in their buildings, right? So it's an issue in all big cities. Some of the living conditions are very poor, and landlords aren't necessarily assuming their responsibilities to make sure that health standards are kept up, right? We can all relate to that in Toronto and in Montreal, right? I'm sure we all have that problem. It's normal for big cities. So we could search by infractions or types of infractions, but it was very difficult to search by the names of landlords, right? Because landlords are powerful lobbies. They're groups of interest groups that don't necessarily want to be pointed at. They own a lot of property, things like that. They pay a lot of taxes. So what we did is that, and this is actually a separate group. This isn't Montréal Ouvert, but this is another group in Montreal. And they scraped the data. They reorganized it in a way that you're able to search by the name of the landlord. So now you know that if a landlord that has a history of committing different infractions in terms of health sanitary issues purchases a new building in a different borough, then as a group that works on the ground protecting the rights of tenants, you're then able to search that database to go and talk to the tenants preemptively and to warn them about what could happen in your building. Because that person who just bought this property, or who may want to change it into a condo or these things, may act in a certain way. So it enabled these groups that were already working, these community organizations, to coordinate each other in a way that was way more effective than they could before. Okay? So this is a quote from a community organizer with Project Genesis. Sorry for the typo. And to me, this is just a beautiful quote. Okay? Anybody who does open data and who can connect it with community organizing, just a quick note to tell you that the database has already been super helpful. We have a landlord who is illegally converting apartment blocks into condos in our neighborhood, and we use the database to tour his different addresses door to door. We discovered that he has another building where he has already said that he will kick out tenants next year. The database allows us then to take preventive steps to warn tenants that they may become illegally evicted from their building. Thank you very much. It is a tool that is already making a big difference in our field work. Okay, so direct application of open data. The scraping and the cleaning up of the data took time, but it was done at different hackathons. Okay, but it's what happened in between and how these different groups that were already offering different services to their tenants, or different tenants, were able to then, collaborate and become more efficient, essentially. The next one here. This is the follow-up to hacking corruption that I talked about. Okay, this is the public contracts database. So the public contracts database. So what they've done is an audit. They've cleaned up the data themselves. So it's a group of 10, 12 people that are now meeting almost every month, working on this data in collaboration with the Treasury of the provincial government in Quebec City, because they've released the data in an open format so that it facilitates their work but the government isn't cleaning it himself. The citizens are cleaning the data, and they're finding interesting things. They're finding things like, for example, just this morning, I was looking at just a thread, a group, that's been created around this project. There are some names of corporations or different organizations that have like 2 dots behind their name, or 3 dots, or the spelling is different. In some countries, and I'm not saying that this is the case for this database, but we had somebody from Transparency International, okay, who had worked in Russia, right? And she was saying at this last meeting, well, in some countries that have faced challenges, the code of how to single out a company could be related directly to corruption and collusion problems, okay? Because certain companies may be fronts for different things, etc. We don't know if that's the case. It's not the police that's doing this. These are citizens that are raising flags and like pointing out that, there's discrepancies here, or even in the numbers or the dollar amounts of different contracts that have discrepancies. We're able to point that out, clean up the books of the city, clean up the books of the provincial government. So again, this is it's taken a life of its own, and these are these citizens that are very, very involved doing this. Maybe I'll save questions for the end, okay? It's going to be easier. So as you can see, I won't go too much into detail here, but the point of this slide here is that the ecosystem is expanding, okay? There are many, many players, and this is probably just a fraction of the players now that are evolving, okay? You mentioned Open North earlier, very, very active. John Brunn, he's on the board with Open North, he works with us too. Québec Ouvert on the left, that's the umbrella group for these different open data citizens initiatives around the province. I'm also co-founder of Québec Ouvert. So we have Montréal Ouvert, who's the driving force at the municipal level, but then there's like Capitale Ouverte in Quebec City, then we have Gatineau Ouvert in Gatineau, and probably in other cities in the upcoming year. So we needed to have an umbrella organization that we could use to talk to officials at the provincial level. Moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the hackathons that we've organized or that have been organized in the city, because I know that there's a reflection here in Toronto about how to push that model forward and to take it to the next level. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about 2 events that took place this year. So EcoHack is one of them. This is around like urban sustainability issues, and the issue here was to urban sustainability. There's a lot of people that are interested in urban sustainability. It's not something that would just target developers, right? I mean, you can think of a lot of different types of people who would want to be engaged on the issues related to that. So this was really a process of organizing. The first event was a social event, and there was 90 people who came to it. And it wasn't about data. It was about identifying issues around urban sustainability, as broad as that. Okay? And then based on the issues that were prioritized, or where we saw an overlap in terms of interest, then we started looking at what's the data behind it, and what's the problem-solving process that we can attach to these questions that are being asked, and who has that data, and what data is already available, and who do we need to talk to at the city to be able to get that data, and what format is it in, and how can we start creating groups and projects around these themes and work with these different organizations and different stakeholders that have a stake or are interested in it. So EcoHack had kind of put a twist in the hackathon model, in that it asked these different community organizations to propose challenges, because they might have also data of their own. Okay, so we were talking a little bit earlier before we started that it's not just government data that we're interested in. A lot of community organizations, a lot of research bodies, a lot of bigger organizations already have data. So we wanted to encourage smaller organizations or organizations that provide services like food security services to put a challenge and to provide their data out there and to get teams excited about it and see what they could do with it. So that was one of the things that we did. It worked well. It took 7 months to organize. During that 7 months, we organized probably, there was like a core group and it was led by a guy called Alex Ayet, who's like an MIT student in Boston, and so he was kind of the driving force behind it. But there were all types of people around the table, including Montréal Ouvert, Open North, but also these different civic organizations that were interested in urban sustainability issues. So 7 months, and we had many different events where people could prepare the ground for the work that they were wanting to complete as much as possible at the hackathon. So this whole preparatory stage was very important in the process, so that we could hit the ground running at the event itself. The second hackathon that I'd like to talk about is the GeoHack. So GeoHack was around geomatic data. It was organized in the middle of the week after a major geomatic event, okay, in Montreal. It was in partnership with the Canadian Association of Geomatics, okay, so you already had that kind of institutional relationship that was built. It was free to register, but participants were paid to attend. Okay, so another twist, okay, just to see if that would work. We had 8 teams. I wasn't involved in the organization, but there's only so much you can do there. But so there was 8 teams, 8 projects. So it was a smaller event, but really trying to get the right people in the room, more of a specialized crowd, and to really focus on deliverables around geomatics. Okay, with like more specialized kind of IT and developers collaborating together in collaboration with the different partners that they had linked up with. So a few weeks ago, because there were so many hackathons that were happening, right? And it was sometimes hard to keep track. So Montréal Ouvert organized a meeting of all the different people who organize hackathons. And that was part of Montréal Ouvert's mandate, to be able to, okay, let's create that space where we can come together and have a self-reflexive kind of moment where we can think critically about how far we've come, what challenges we've encountered in organizing hackathons, and also how far we want to take it, okay? And what can we do together to kind of learn from each other's experiences. So, some key things, okay? Key takeaways that I want to share with you. First of all, the name, hackathon, right? There's a certain perception of hacking. We're not hacking, and it's, in French, there's different terminology for it that we use, but we're trying to like kind of move away from that perception because it kind of scares people. It scares bureaucrats, at least in Montreal. So we're talking about maybe a code fest, or if you have any ideas, share them, because to me code fest doesn't sound great. But and then there was the risk of preventing the developer community to be perceived as cheap labor, also, right? So that was also a key concern. And then the flip side of that issue is, well, if you have contracts that result from hackathons, what are the risks of inserting money into that collaborative dynamic where people come with a motivation to participate in a project, not necessarily because they want money, but because they're enjoying collaborating with other people around this problem-solving exercise using open data. So there's a certain issue there. The competitive factor of getting contracts out of a collaborative endeavor can also skew the way that people interact with one another and co-create these wonderful projects. Okay, so there's the risk there. I'm not saying there shouldn't be benefits and there shouldn't be contracts, but we need to keep that in mind because the collaborative space is very important. And also, how do you get the city to engage at the preparatory step? To have that conversation earlier on, to be able to identify that data set, clean it up, to make sure that you're able to use and maximize the time that you have together, and then already have your groups formed ahead of the hackathon. There's, and I'm sure, well, I don't know, but you tell me if that's the case, but hackathons can also become a platform for big announcements by communication departments or whoever. It's an opportunity, it's a platform, high visibility. You have a group, it's a a free space of stakeholders that are in the room. So if you can announce, like, we're going to release this data set, go for it. But maybe the format isn't right, or so you have to be careful that hackathons don't become kind of a space for a PR exercise from the city, and that's a concern. I'm pretty sure that's something that probably applies in different cities around the country. And then there's the issue of how to ensure a stable infrastructure for the websites that are created. Right? You have these developers that come together, they create these projects, but then they don't necessarily want to pay for the domain name forever. And so there's been great applications that were launched a few years ago, but now that don't exist anymore because they've moved on, right? Which is a pity, because services and the ideas at the beginning were great, and they should, we should be able to kind of still benefit from them. One key thing also that came out of that meeting was how to engage journalists more into the process, to help build that momentum, but then to create the context around these applications that are created. If we're talking about problem solving, a journalist well-versed in open data can understand the challenges around open data, but also create an explanation of why that application and that solution that's being developed by different community stakeholders matters, okay? And I think in Montreal we've started to do this, and I think it's going in the right direction, but there's a catch with journalists. They want to have the scoop, right? So it's difficult to have a group of journalists together to agree on a common strategy on how to help each other out, right? Because they always want to be able to know, okay, what's the latest, or what angle can I get? The exclusivity is, when you're talking media strategy. I'm almost done. I have 2 more slides, and then I want to open it up for questions. So all of this was happening, okay, and then the elections were on their way. And in Montreal, one of the things that we wanted to do was to kind of change the tone of the conversation. We had built up our credibility. People recognized Montréal Ouvert as like a leader, okay, in the open data field. We had linkages, we had the network, it was good, we were established. We had the links with the administration, but the fear that we had is that we would end up with a candidate who wasn't committed to open data and to continue the work that was already underway, okay? And so obviously we had to respect the democratic process, but we wanted to make sure that the main candidates at for the mayorship were going to talk about open data as part of the conversation during the campaign, so that open data would become a core component of their pledges made during the campaign. Not least within their platforms, but also publicly, and in specifics. Okay, so we designed a questionnaire. This is just one part of the questionnaire, and we asked them to publicly announce whether or not they would release those data sets. Okay, and there was a list of, I think, like 35 different data sets that we identified on contract allocation, budgetary data, services delivery, democratic data, municipal council meetings data. Okay, so a thorough list said, are you going to release this if you get elected? And each of the 4 candidates completed the questionnaire, okay? Because it became a competition between each other, right? And we used it, And we're like, he did it. Why aren't you filling out the questionnaire? And we're very active on Twitter and using all of the networks, and through interviews, we wrote op-eds. We were very, very active in doing this. And I think our ability to be able to get the 4 main candidates to do it also reflected or proved that we were a nonpartisan organization, that we weren't being seen as favoring one candidate against another. Okay, and that's always been very, very important to us. Okay, and then what it did, obviously, when the next mayor got elected, we'll see, hey, you completed our questionnaire, remember? So now let's get to work. So you said you were going to release this data set and that data set. Let's have a conversation about that now. But let's not just have a conversation about that. Let's talk about taking the open data ecosystem in Montreal at the next step. And so some of the things that we're talking about with the new mayor and his administration very early on, because this is Denis Coderre, and Denis Coderre in his platform was talking about open data. And he was talking about smart cities. He wasn't defining what smart cities was about, but he was talking about smart cities, right? And so we had there's a fear, obviously, that smart cities would become something led by the corporate sector, big contracts, big companies that come in. And this whole side of civic engagement that I talked about before in all these civic institutions, we want to make sure that we have a democratic smart city, right? That engages citizens in a meaningful way, and that open data is really at the center of that collaborative process that happens between these different stakeholders. So some of the key things that we're asking to take open data to the next level in Montreal, things that can be done very quickly, like checkbook NYC. If anybody's familiar with that, in New York City, every check that's intended for public funding to fund different projects is put online right away. Okay, checkbook NYC. Why can't we do this in Montreal? Okay, why can't we do this in Toronto? You know, why can't we do this in all cities? And then contract data. We want to have submissions. We want to know if there's subcontractors for different public projects. We want to see the bids for that. You know, this is data now that, and you're noticing, I'm changing my tone. Before we were the nice guys with the nice logo, right? Now we're changing from collaborating to demanding. Because we're at that stage now that there's an expectation that if you're going to go forward with open data, then you need to be serious about it. We're far beyond the end of the beginning, where there was a nice portal, and we could say, yes, we're doing this. Really, we're doing this? Let's do this for real. Okay, so let's talk about real data. And then the next thing that we'd like to see in Montreal, that San Francisco has done very well, is a chief innovation officer. Let's get somebody who does outreach, somebody who makes the city more accessible, not just around open data, but around innovation. So let's get open data part of that conversation, but to have a figurehead, somebody who could be the face of innovation at the city, accountable to the mayor of Montreal. And let's get that person to chair that working group that I talked about before. So that the CIO internally is able to manage the change in the institutional challenges that takes place to format the data and to make sure the departments talk to each other and tasking each other to do that. Another important thing, a political directive. So we have the policy, but let's get the political leadership to really back it up systematically, okay? With high value data sets, targets, and to get the politicians to push the bureaucracy in that direction so that different tiers work together to make it happen. So we don't know what's going to happen in the next. There hasn't been many announcements around open data at the city since the new mayor has come to power. Smart cities is something that is as promising as we have to be cautious with it. But I think there's a lot of opportunities around that idea, as long as we don't lose the kind of the underbelly of cities, which is the base, which is citizens that occupy the city that are there, that can collaborate and create these great projects around open data. So that's the end of my talk. Questions?
Thank you.